Hi, my name's Jen Ford, Principal Restoration Ecologist with Ecosure. Coming to you today from Yagara, Turrbal country. Weed control. Well, let's face it, it's part of every restoration project. But how do we do it so it's effective and efficient? Well, one of the things I was taught when I started studying 25 years ago was to always make sure that weed control was done systematically and comprehensively. What we did in the first set of videos was assess our site, so we understood where to start and how to intervene. In the second video, we looked at perhaps planning for our restoration site, so hoping now that we've got some good zones worked out. And now it's about understanding weeds and weed control, which technique to apply, when to apply it, and how to work each zone comprehensively before starting the next zone. There's 3 stages to weed control. 1, primary weed control. That's our initial control of weeds in an area, usually the understory. Techniques that would be involved in this stage might be the cut, scrape and paint of woody weeds in the understory. It might be scrape and paint of some vines, like Madeira vine. It could be spot spraying or overspraying, so spot spraying ground covers and exotic seedlings, or overspraying a chunk of lantana once it had been prepared. It might even be a spot of hand weeding in there. One thing's for sure, we need to fully do that zone before moving on to the second zone. And making sure, first of all, that that zone has also had the second stage, follow-up. That's when, we've gone through that primary weed control, we've controlled a lot of weeds, and now space has become available, light has become available, water, nutrients. So the things that take advantage of that is often more weeds as well as the natives. So the timing for follow-up weed control is critical. Not too frequent that we're in there all the time and impacting the things that are germinating, or perhaps not even identifying the correct species. And not leaving it too long that those natives that are germinating are not fully swamped by the weeds. So follow-up stage is critical, and timing that is absolutely imperative to get that ecological result. The third stage is maintenance. And we might be maintaining a site for 2 years, 5 years. It all depends on the capacity of that site to recover. It depends on the weeds that you're dealing with. It depends what's happening in the soil seed bank. It depends what's still coming onto your site. But maintenance is critical. And if we go back to some of our goals, which is, trying to get a self-functioning ecosystem, well, getting a site to a level of minimum maintenance has to be one of our objectives. There are a number of approaches and techniques, as I've just mentioned, to weed control. Some are manual, require a little bit more effort, and perhaps don't apply herbicide, while others we need to use herbicide. I suppose some of the variables in choosing which approach you would use might come to the size of the area that you are trying to restore. It might come down to the types of weeds that you're trying to control. So, some of the organic or manual controls. Well, there's hand pulling. That's a great way to control some weeds, and it works well if you've got a few soft annuals, or perhaps you're preparing a site for spot spraying and you're getting through and pulling a few things out to make sure that those natives are more obvious when you go through spot spraying. There's also a wonderful technique called crowning, which is good when you have certain root systems, like for instance if you're controlling a small amount of exotic grass within, a sclerophyll site. And that way you can use your knife to get in and around it. There's also things like if you are working in a soft soil, sandy soil, where you can do some hand pulling and it's not going to break your back, well, that's also appropriate. But once you start getting onto bigger sites, the level of soil disturbance that you're kind of creating with a lot of hand pulling, not to mention the physical impacts, probably don't suit that approach. So that's when we might move to some of the more chemically applied or herbicide applied techniques. If we do go down that route, which we will also demonstrate the advantages of doing, allows you to get through much bigger areas, it allows you to control a much greater variety of weeds successfully. I often see areas where there's been hand pulling and roots are left in and the weed simply reshoots. So sometimes doing a cut and paint really facilitates good control on that weed. Applying herbicides is often a common approach to controlling weeds, simply because we tend to get through a much bigger area than if we were only applying organic approaches or more manual approaches. There's just some distinct advantages in that. For instance, if you hand pull a weed or it's hard to get out and you hurt yourself, maybe cut, scrape and painting is a better option for a woody weed in the understory. If you are applying herbicides, you really need to make sure you have the correct licenses in place, that you have the correct protective equipment on, you know, proper gloves, long pants, long sleeves, your hat, everything on there, perhaps sometimes your safety eyewear. These are a little bit groovier than your average pair of safety glasses, but today that'll do the trick just so I can see you. Whatever is the case, make sure that you've read the label of the herbicide you're applying and that you really understand that material safety data sheet to understand, again, the risks that are associated with herbicide use, as well as, well, some of those advantages, and that you are using the right rates. And if you're not, that you perhaps have an off-label permit that covers you for a rate that might be slightly different to that of the label. What we don't want to do is create resistance in our weeds. They're hard enough to control as it is. So there's still a lot of debate about whether to start works in perhaps the most intact vegetation, moving through to the more degraded vegetation, or whether we in fact start in the degraded patches and work through to the more intact patches. There's a few things that might influence that. For instance, if you are starting in a degraded patch, you kind of know what you're up for. You know how to maintain them, you know the frequency that's required, or can at least learn that. And as you progress through your site or through the zone, you know that need for intensive work gets a little bit less. If, for instance, there is a patch that is highly degraded, or you have a very invasive weed such as Madeira vine or cat's claw, by getting in there early, you might be able to save yourselves a heap of time and energy. If you start only in the good patches, well, you might spend the next few years only working in those patches and not really progress the recovery of your site. So good to weigh these things up, and that really comes into play when you are designing your zones and designing and understanding where to start work. What you don't want to do, however, is have that really highly intensive work zone right at the other end of your site from where your access point is. Because one of the keys to understanding how you're going to be able to maintain that site is hopefully that you get to walk past that more intensive zone more regularly on the way to your next work zone. So you don't want to have that right up in your far corner and only ever go to that far corner, because there's a strong chance that, well, you're never going to get back to that in time. And again, those natives that germinate get smothered by the weeds, resulting in the soil seed bank becoming exhausted. Prioritising work needs to consider both the budget and the time frames, and the presence of things like declared weeds, the presence of weeds that might have long-term effects on the site. Perhaps they've got a really long seed viability, or perhaps they're really destructive, like fast-growing vines that are impacting not only the understory but the mid-story and the canopy. It might also be that there's flammable vegetation, like a heap of lantana, that is sitting perhaps on an ecotone between a sclerophyll system and a dry rainforest system. And we've really got to protect that dry rainforest system from fire. That might mean that we go in there and more immediately prioritise that area. Having access will also influence where we prioritise things, but regardless, it's a systematic and comprehensive approach to weed control that is absolutely essential, and it is where we are going to find our biggest successes, as well as efficiencies of both finances and our own energy. Cut, scrape and paint. one of the more common control techniques to use, particularly on woody weeds in the understory. You can probably control pretty successfully doing cut, scrape and paint up to trees maybe that big. Once they get bigger than that, we then tend to use another technique called stem injection. So anyway, I'm just going to grab this Himalayan ash. You can just see I'm just going to cut it up into smaller bits because they then are scattered, left on the ground to break down over time. And I'm going to just clear a little bit around the base here so I can see its height. I've got my trusty little poison pot here. In this pot we've got 1 part glyphosate, 1.5 parts water. So sometimes you can cut things at a slight angle to perhaps gather a bit more surface area, or just flat. We don't want to go more than maybe 1 or 2 centimetres above the soil. So cutting off that Himalayan ash, having my paint pot nice and close next to me so I'm not dripping herbicide all over the place, painting that. And as it's a cut, scrape and paint, I'm then going to use my knife to take away a little bit more bark and add to that surface area. And then I'm going to paint that again. Now some species you can get away with just doing a cut and paint, perhaps something like a small leaf privet, or in some circumstances where you've added metsulfuron methyl or brush killer to your poison pot, you can get away with a cut and paint. This is quite low toxicity, goes straight into the plant. I'm done. Moving on systematically to the next spot. So while I don't usually pick out a whole lot of individual weeds, this Ochna cerulata or Mickey Mouse bush, real bugger up here, and I know affects lots of places. So I'm going to show you a couple of variations to the cut, scrape and paint technique because this plant has a particularly long taproot. And we've found here, particularly in the subtropics, that if we don't get nice and low down that taproot, it will reshoot. Basal barking as a treatment often reshoots. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a variation on the cut, scrape and paint technique. So I'm going to clear a little bit of space around the base so I can see what I'm doing. Grab my knife and I'm going to excavate a little bit lower, maybe up to about 1 inch. Get that herbicide translocating lower down into that big taproot. If it can get past that little kink that Ochna always has, we're in a much better position for controlling it once and for all. So you can see I've got about 1 inch of soil excavated. I'm still going to do a cut, scrape and paint, but there's a couple of variations apart from that digging. So my cut's already lower, it's already just at soil level. I'm going to chop that up later and just leave it on the ground scattered. I'm going to get my herbicide on there within 10 seconds so it doesn't, those capillaries don't all close off and stop accepting it. And again, I'm going to use my knife. Now on this occasion with Ochna and say some of the more Myrtaceae species like guava, the scrape needs to be light. Not nice and heavy like I just showed before, but nice and light because the cambium system sits really close to the surface. So I'm just going to do a nice light little scrape and again try and get as much of it as I can to really increase that surface area and get more herbicide travelling down through the system. Avoiding the soil wherever you can is great because soil actually neutralises glyphosate, which is a complex salt. So again, I'm going to use my paintbrush, get it on there, go again. Now some people use squirty bottles to do that. I prefer a paintbrush because I like the accuracy that it provides. But certainly a sauce bottle or an applicator bottle will do the trick as well. You can see there I've got no herbicide going into the soil. She's apples. And then what I do is I often then just chop everything else up. I don't know, 30, 50 centimetre pieces, nothing too major. And leave it on the ground to act as mulch. Scraping and painting. It's a great technique to be able to use for weeds in a couple of situations. One is to control more mature Madeira vine. Madeira vine has a lot of aerial tubers and it also has a ground tuber. And what we want to do often is leave that Madeira vine in situ because if it's cut, the aerial tubers then tend to fall over a really prolonged time, therefore extending the need for ongoing resources and much longer maintenance periods. So scraping it in big chunky 1 metre lengths, leaving a little gap and doing it again the other side for as much of the vine as you can reach. Really fantastic way for that herbicide to move in and around the system and affect some of those tubers. Another application is to control smaller ocnus or Mickey Mouse bush. This species has a modified root system, a very long tap root, so even something like this I'm not going to be able to pull out. In Sydney, they are able to apply this scrape and paint technique to even larger ones, but here in Turrbal Yagara country or Brisbane, we can't get away with that, probably largely due to the soil types and the rainfalls. So this one I'm going to scrape and paint and leave it in situ. Again, it's all about getting that herbicide travelling around the system and most importantly down through that big J root and down into that quite deep root system. So I'm just going to clear a little bit again around my base so I know what I'm doing. I'm trying to avoid the soil because that can neutralise the herbicide. And then I'm going to do a really light scrape. You can see that there. I'm going to end up doing 2 scrapes, so one either side, but again nice and light because I want to make sure that that herbicide is beautifully transported around that system. And then I'm going to paint it. Now, one of the tricks that we've found to successfully controlling large infestations of Mickey Mouse bush, which we're often dealing with, particularly in the understory and really blocking up that capacity for a site to recover, is we add a little bit of metsulfurin to the poison pot. So again, dissolving that with a little bit of water and doing it at 1:1 with glyphosate. I'm just going to do the other side. And again, it's all about volume, getting enough into this little plant so it moves around the system. It's probably a bit woody for a spot spray to work, and this gets lots of herbicide in safely without splashing it around everywhere and gets a good control on this ochna. The bigger ones, we do that variation to the cut, scrape and paint, and the really big ones we're going to stem inject. It's going to let these foam barks really take off without that competition now. Gouge and paint's another good technique to use on certain weed species that might have a big fleshy modified root system that sits well above the soil, or at least close to the surface of the soil. So here we've got some Asparagus africanus, quite a nasty climbing weed that really impacts mostly the understory, but all the way through to the mid-story. So I'm first going to cut it all off at head height. We never pull things out of the canopy. Always leave that above our heads to just fall naturally over time. Often when we pull things down, we're hurting the very natives that we're trying to protect. I've also seen someone pull a log on their head once as well, and another time when someone pulled a snake on their head. So leave it up there, that'll all fall over time, and the beauty of that is native seedlings that are in the understory will also get a chance to adapt to the new light levels. So we're getting that out of the way, finding where our base is, which is here. Look at this lovely little one. It's not too big. We get them a lot bigger. And this one, you can see here, it's got a great little fleshy rhizome that's sitting above the soil. So I'm going to cut this quite low using my loppers. These are great loppers, by the way. Look at this. Look at this for energy. Not my energy, this energy. Look at this. Look at that. You know, there's a lot of stuff in that. And I can go further by really using my knife to gouge into it. Those lovely kookaburras will probably love this bit of disturbance, come in and get any insects that I dislodge during the process. And again, I'm putting on that herbicide mix. Oh, yes, soaking that right up. So you've heard me mention cat's claw quite a few times. I reckon it's probably the worst weed in Australia. How fast it grows, the way it brings down entire ecosystems, both from affecting the ground at 100% carpets, the mid-story collapsing canopies. Large mature vines get up to this big and are extraordinarily heavy. So often if it's present on our site, even in small amounts, it's really important to get in there and perhaps prioritise that as one of the areas. It might end up becoming your zone 1, or if it's not, it's definitely a priority on your site, because once it gets across your site, well, it becomes really expensive and very labour intensive. So just the primary treatment of cat's claw, you can see it's going up here. This isn't a massive vine or anything like that. But what we're going to do is cut it at about waist height. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to pull everything below waist height off the tree before I treat the base. This is largely because this has a very resilient underground tuber. Some of the bigger cat's claws, they have tubers this big, a connector, and something else that large underneath. So it has huge amounts of energy that we need to try and reduce over time, and that means maintenance, 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 maintenance. If you've got cat's claw on your site, you're there for the next 5 years minimum. So what we're going to do, by taking this off the lower levels, we can tell when that cat's claw is reshot and when we need to do that next follow-up run. So I'm going to get in here, and then I'm going to get all these off right around the tree, skirt them off the whole way along. And everything up there, right up in the canopy, will die. And then we're just going to perform, again, a cut, scrape and paint. Getting in again, nice and low with a cut and a paint. And again, that's scrape to increase that surface area. Look, here's a tiny vine. It's so skinny, and look, it's already got that tuber. So you can imagine what those big vines have. Anyway, we're going to do each one of them. So just due to access, I'm going to get in there and do my scrape first. My paint. Again, really important to get it onto the weed within that sort of 10 seconds. And then again, oh, she's a bit stronger. My cut and paint. So you can see here, it's already all those thin ones growing up, can become really laborious. So what we might do, if it's a big infestation, we might again cut all these off at waist height, and then maybe simply grab a lot of them together and do a cut, scrape and paint, or cut them really low to the ground and spray the regrowth. Because if everything's like this and you have hectares of it, you're going to be there for an awfully long time. You're going to be there for a long time anyway, but add this to the mix, and which technique you choose to do, really it's how much effort and resources that you have that influence that decision. Spot spraying, what a great technique to be able to get through large areas, both at the primary stage when you're perhaps controlling a lot of exotic ground covers, a lot of exotic seedlings, vines that are trailing along the ground. Also really great through the follow-up and maintenance period, although follow-up can be a bit more delicate because often at that stage we've got a lot of natives and weeds germinating. So you've really got to have good plant identification skills at that point. As a maintenance tool, oh my gosh, it is fantastic. And we wouldn't be able to work any site perhaps larger than a hectare if we weren't perhaps utilising this technique. So one of my colleagues, Duncan, and I are going to work through this area. We're mainly controlling grasses at this point, but I just want to illustrate some of the techniques that you might need to have if you are spot spraying through the bush. And one of them, as I mentioned, is good plant identification skills. The other is being able to work comprehensively and systematically. So we're not leaving big gaps in the middle here. Sure, you need to think about whether we need to retain some grass in a particular area or a particular weeds in a particular area if it maybe is threatened by erosion. But we're going to work through all of this because we know that our soil seed bank's intact. We also know that there's good recovery potential here. So we're going to work through as a team, and because we've got dye in our pot, we're able to really get through and make sure that every little bit is covered. Now you can see I'm using my foot to push weeds out of the way of that native commelina. Gumboots are great because they're an impermeable surface, so you can really work through your site. Also using a great adjustable nozzle. This nozzle will allow us to get down to a really fine point and be able to spray something like that. Even that was probably a bit heavy-handed. We can go lighter than that. Or do blanket spraying. also with a little bit more oomph and really pumping the lever here, we build up a whole lot of pressure, and we can use this, turn the nozzle and do overspraying, which we'll show you in a moment. But yeah, spot spraying, fantastic technique. Everything dies in situ. Sometimes it's necessary to do a little bit of site preparation. Make sure if you've got a lot of regen that you're perhaps coming back onto your site and you need to go around and hand weed or push and pull weeds away from the natives that you're trying to save. Sometimes in really big thick grass you can tie that grass into a knot if it's beside a little native that you're trying to protect. No need to be heavy-handed. It always takes a long time to understand what rates of control to use, how much you need to apply to any given weed. But this one's, we're going to go pretty light. All of these die fairly easily. You can see here that Duncan and I are pretty close next to each other to again make sure we're not missing out any of the weeds. And if I were to sillily scoot ahead, he might need to call me back again to make sure that both of our lines are meeting up and we haven't left big gaps in the middle. I'm just leaving a little bit of this on the edge on the slope here to assist with stability. So you can see here with this lovely hairy electron, if that were a little bit smaller and clearly we're trying to avoid it, the use of a gumboot can be really helpful if I was getting something beside it. Sometimes in really thick rainforest, I'll even carry a small water bottle on me, so if I accidentally get a native, I can squirt it off straight away. Really good idea if you're working through really thick bush is to turn around, make sure that you've got all your weeds. Just getting that different angle, you can sometimes, oh yeah, missed that one. And if it's windy, you need to consider whether A, you want to spray, or B, can you just increase that droplet size so there's no movement in the wind. But always keeping an eye on the weather, whether it's going to rain, whether it might be windy, whatever it might be. Today, we've got a lovely day. Oh, Dunks, I'll just go around this patch, mate, if you can come in there. Communication when spraying is absolutely key to doing systematic, consolidated, comprehensive work. Whatever you can do to use your balancing skills and your dexterity, great for spot spraying. And try not to bend over too much when you've got your pack on, because it can leak out the lid. So keep your back straight if you've got to jump down, or if you've got a section where you've got to do a bit of hand weeding, take the pack off, then pop it back on. You don't need to wear half your herbicide. This is a lovely organic dye, so no toxicity to any plants or to animals. Some people prefer pink, others blue. Sometimes depends what sort of ecosystem you're working in and whether you've got light or shade. And if you happen to have lots of guys that might be colourblind, sometimes they're not so good with seeing the red dye. Overspraying, another really useful technique, particularly where you want to retain some structure, retain some habitat. So for instance, if you have a gap within a forest that's full of pretty vibrant lantana, overspraying can be a really good technique to allow the lantana to die in situ. You don't just walk into a gap and then go for it. It needs a little bit of preparation. So that means using your loppers to cut tracks through it. Because when you're overspraying it, you might get your herbicide about 5 metres. And so you need to make sure that your track network or cutting around underneath the drip lines of trees as you get around, that your area is prepared for the overspraying. So you're not actually wiping out the natives that you're trying to save. We use a dye to again assist with marking where we're spraying and what we haven't hit. You've got to be really careful of what are the conditions. If you've got a really windy day, you don't do overspraying as an activity. And if you're doing overspraying with the team, again, think about where the wind's coming from to make sure that you're not coating one of your colleagues with the drift of the spray. You've got to get round, get a nice kind of technique, making sure that all the growing points are covered, that it's nicely covered, but not to the point of runoff. You just don't need runoff. It's just a good cover of the lantana. Sometimes it's a really good technique with bitu bush on the coast as well, because again, leaving the bitu bush in situ is a really good way to help alleviate some of those salt-laden winds coming in that might then impact on more sensitive vegetation. So getting in and around and leaving vegetation intact, dying in situ, retains habitat, helps with buffering winds, whether it's salt-laden winds, cold winds in winter. Even once on a rainforest remnant, we'd use lantana around the outside, cut it from inside the remnant, spray the grass out on the outside of the lantana, and the lantana used to roll out, always providing a lovely buffer and therefore a beautiful microclimate to protect things from wind on the inside. So I talked a little bit about some of the primary weed control techniques, things like cut, scrape and paint, spot spraying, overspraying. This one's about stem injection, but you don't do it in those primary stages. And if we do, we often end up with a pretty dire situation. You see, if you stem inject something like this one's a Chinese elm or Celtis sinensis, suddenly you let in a lot of light to this area, and also the moisture and the nutrients become available. So if you haven't done your weed control in the understory first, the very things that take advantage of all those resources are the weeds. So we want to make sure that we're at a point where everything that remains in the understory can handle those new light conditions. Over here we've got a beautiful brown currajong. This plant has a 150-year seed viability. It's been sitting in that soil seed bank for who knows how many years. And as soon as we let in a tiny bit more light and there's more of those resources available, it's going to really start growing to its full potential. So absolutely vital that all weeds are controlled in the understory first. The other thing with stem injection, particularly if you're regenerating rainforest or some of those ecosystems that have a more dense canopy, is to think about when you do it. For instance, would you do it in the middle of a really hot summer where everything's already a bit stressed? Probably not. The fact that it's providing a bit of shade is probably pretty good. And doing it in the cool of winter doesn't work so well either. So if you are going to stem inject and you're not sure if you're doing it at the right time, sometimes you can do a little cut in the base to see if the herbicide's been drawn in. I know in winter in the subtropics you wouldn't bother stem injecting anything before 10 a.m. So we've done weed control around this. Usually I use a proper injector kit. They're kind of designed from the good old days of when you would do dripping to cattle. It sits on your back, and if you're at a stage in your weed control and restoration program that you can do a lot of stem injection, maybe every third camphor laurel on the site or something like that, because you're working on recovering that site through assisted regeneration, you could do a whole half a day or third of the day of it. But today I'm just going to use this little fella. It's the same principle. We're just about getting the herbicide into those cuts. You can also use a drill, which is obviously a little bit more expensive, but really effective and efficient in terms of time and energy. Today I'm just going to use my $20 tomahawk just to demonstrate how to do it and ensure that we've got this brick-back pattern going. So, some people like a forehand, some people like a backhand. Doesn't really matter. But what you need to make sure is that all your cuts overlap each other. Something this size probably only needs about 3 or 4 or 5 rows of cuts. And if you have some lateral roots, get some in along those as well, maybe a little V cut. Again, it's all about getting the volume of herbicide into the tree, because what we want to do is leave this tree in situ. It dies in situ. And for many years, a camphor laurel will stay standing in the canopy for 5, 8, 10 years, still acting as a bird perch, still providing great habitat. And you can see the difference. Something like this is going to take me 3 minutes to kill, whereas if I was going to cut down and then deal with all the debris that probably crushes my understory anyway, I might be looking at several hours work. For a big camphor laurel, it's probably days and days versus maybe, half an hour worth of treatment. So much better to leave it in situ and standing and still act as habitat. One word of caution though, you do have to think about where you do your stem injection. If you're on the edge of a busy pathway or perhaps a public reserve where lots of people are going through, you may not want to leave, say, a Chinese elm standing there, because they tend to fall in about 2 years' time. So I'm going to get in. I've cleared myself a little bit of space so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to go backhand. And then what I'm aiming for is a bit of a 45-degree angle into the tree. A cut, a cut. And you can see we've got a little bit of dye in this to demonstrate. And you can see that cut is overlapped into that one and hasn't spilt. Now, really important to wear safety eyewear with this usually, because if you accidentally hit the same cut and it spurts back, you don't want this stuff in your eyes. I tend to do a couple of cuts at the same time. But again, just like cut, scrape and paint, you want to get your herbicide in there in that 10 to max 15 second time period. So it's really taken up by the tree. You can even use your tomahawk to peel that back a bit. And just keep applying. Now, sometimes if I'm doing something big, like a really big camphor laurel, and I know it's got that big chunky modified root system, a lignituber, I'm going to probably give those cuts a little bit more, knowing that just might need it. And you can see each time, if I've put too much in there, that overflow is going down into the cut below. That's why I tend to do it in sections. And remember, any horizontal or lateral roots, nice little V there, lovely. And keep moving around the tree. Now this is a lovely single stem tree, but if we had something that had a multi-stem tree, then we would have to make sure that we did some cuts higher up on the inside of those branches. Some of the weeds are so clever that if you don't actually get that inside tissue, it'll continue to live all the way up into the canopy. Making sure when you've got all around your tree, you actually even do a final check as well to ensure that you haven't left any big gaps. If you have a big gap left and you haven't got an overlapping cut in there, again, that tissue will be alive all the way up into the canopy. And just a final check. That'll well and truly kill that Celtis. The other way to do stem injection is by using a drill. There's a slightly different technique, but it really helps if you're having to do a lot of them. Obviously a little bit more coin involved in buying a drill and keeping it in good working order. But this particular one, a really good drill with an 8mm drill bit. And what we're going to do, it's a similar technique. Essentially, you could go in around the base of the tree, cuts and drill holes not to be up here, nice and low, because the herbicide will go down to the roots before it travels back up. And essentially you're going in and either drilling in or across, just in about, on something like this, about 2 centimetres. But on a camphor laurel, it has thicker bark, you'll need to go deeper, so the well is deeper. And essentially if you can fill that well, it then draws back out using that cambium layer. So you'd maybe go in, say, beautiful, that kind of approach. And you know when it's over full. One of my colleagues, Duncan, he always likes to do a little bit of a side go. So each drill hole meets up, the well of the first drill hole meets up with the second drill hole. And it then becomes a similar technique in that you have this bric-a-brac fashion that things are not ring-barked. We do not want to ring-bark it. That's a no-no. But it is more about making sure that they overlap and the herbicide is in there and getting through to the root system and translocating up through to the canopy. So each drill hole, perhaps on something like about 5 centimetres apart and about 2 to 4 centimetres in. Fill it with your glyphosate and water, just at 1 to 1, same as the ratios that you'd use using the tomahawk. Definitely going to die.